Nevertheless, there's still pragmatic ideas that are still important today from Milton Friedman, even just on the economics level. So let's dig in. Um, Let me try. I took some notes. Let me try to summarize who Milton Friedman is, and then you can correct me.
Yeah.
Okay, so he is widely considered to be one of the greatest and most influential economists in history, not just the 20th century, I think, ever. He was an advocate of economic freedom, like we said, and just individual freedom in general. He strongly advocated for free market capitalism and limited government intervention in the economy. Though you do give, I've listened to basically everything you have on the internet. You give some more depth and nuance on his views on this and in your books. He led the famed Chicago School of Economics, and he won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976. He greatly influenced economic policies during the Reagan administration and other administrations. He was an influential public intellectual, highly influential, not just among economists. He lived 1912 to 2006, so that means he lived and worked through some major world events where his ideas were really important. The Great Depression with the New Deal, World War II with the post-war Reconstruction, the rise and fall of the Bretton Woods monetary system, as we may talk about, the Cold War and all the conflicts involved in that, sort of the tensions around communism and so on. So the fall of the Soviet Union. And also he has some interesting relationships to China's economic transformation
Yep.
since the 1970s, the stagflation of the 1970s, and I'm sure there's a lot more. So can you maybe continue this thread and give a big picture overview of the ideas he is known for?
Yeah, sure, and that's a great summary. You learn fast. So let me start with the economics, and then I can kind of transition to how he used those economic ideas to become a real voice in the American conservative movement, in the American political realm. So I'll kind of highlight four ideas or contributions or episodes. One was his work with Anna Schwartz in revising our understanding of the Great Depression. And that's tightly related to the second, which is the School of Monetarism that he and Schwartz really become founders of. Um, then there is the prediction of stagflation and the explanation of that in the 1970s, which really is one of these sort of career-making predictions, and we can dig into that. And then in terms of technical economics, he's known for the permanent income hypothesis, which he develops with a group of female collaborators that I can talk about. So those are kind of four technical pieces, end up being really brought together in what becomes the Chicago School of Economics. He's undoubtedly the head and the leader of the Chicago School of Economics. There's an earlier generation that he learns from. There's his generation. There's also a Chicago School of Law and Economics that's really profoundly influential. And then there'll be kind of a third generation that he's somewhat distinct from, but that goes on to really shape economics. But let me go back to these kind of four pieces, and let me start with Great Depression. So Milton Friedman actually lives through the Great Depression. He's in college when it hits, and he's in college, it's 1928 to 1932. And he's aware of the Depression, and he's deciding, should I study mathematics or should I study economics? And he's had some good economics teachers, but it's really the context. It's looking around at the slow, dissolving of economic prosperity. So he decides to go to Chicago. He decides to study economics. And what's really interesting is that the Great Depression is so unexpected, it's unpredicted, it's unprecedented, and economists are really struggling to know how to respond to it. And so he's going to arrive at the University of Chicago when the field is struggling to know what to do. So he's in this kind of really open space where the institutional economics of the 1920s has failed to predict, which was focused on business cycles. This is the irony. Their big thing was charting and understanding business cycles. And then we have the biggest business cycle of all time, and they haven't seen it coming, and they don't have a good explanation for it. And what he will get at Chicago is the remnants of a monetary understanding of the economy. And so his teachers, they don't know exactly what's going on, but they look first to the banking crisis. They look first to the in 1933, it's, bank runs, failures of, maybe it's up to a third of American banks. It's huge. Thousands of banks are failing per week. So they're focused on that. So that's the first kind of imprint he will have. The Great Depression has something to do with a banking system. The second imprint he will have is that all of his professors are profoundly concerned about the social crisis. They want relief programs. They want them now. They want bank regulation and financial reform. They're very active. This is not laissez-faire by any stretch of the imagination. So Friedman has that imprinting. And then he gets there in 32, 36, 37, the ideas of John Maynard Keynes from Britain, which has a different explanation. Keynes has a different explanation of the Great Depression, will kind of make landfall in American economics and be very profoundly influential on most American economists. But Friedman it's too late for Friedman. He already has a different perspective. So Keynesianism unfolds. I can say more about that. But it basically leads to more active federal government participation in the economy. And what underlies a lot of that, its adaptation in America particularly, is the idea that capitalism has failed. Capitalism has revealed itself to have a profound flaw in that its cycles of boom and bust create social instability, chaos. It needs to be tamed. It needs to be regulated. And so that becomes the kind of baseline of politics in the United States, the understanding of the New Deal, the understanding of the Democratic Party, even to some extent the understanding of the Republican Party. And Friedman never quite sure about that. He has a hunch that there's something else going on, and he does not buy that capitalism has sort of ground to a halt, or the other idea is that capitalism has gone through some sort of phase transition. And it worked great maybe while we had a frontier. This is a very serious argument that people are making. The United States used to have a frontier, a place where, Europeans hadn't fully settled. Of course, they're pushing out the native tribes. That's another story. But that this frontier is the engine of economic growth, and the frontier is now over, it's closed, and we're going to stagnate. And there's a theory of secular stagnation. And so to deal with secular stagnation, we're just going to have a more active state. So Friedman is suspicious of all these assumptions. And he has this idea that it has something to do with money. Money is somehow important. And so it joins together with Anna Schwartz, who is an economist. She doesn't at this time hold a PhD. She's working for the National Bureau of Economic Research. And they come together to do this study of money in the U.S. economy. And it takes them 12 years to write the book. And they're releasing their ideas and they're arguing. And Friedman is writing papers, giving talks, saying money's really important. And nobody's really believing him. He's a crank. He's at Chicago. He's out, Chicago's a well-known university, but he's sort of considered a crank. And then in 1963, he and Anna Schwartz published this book, and it's, 800 pages. It's a reinterpretation of the history of the United States through money. Like the central character is money, whether it's specie, greenback, or the U.S. currency. And they have a whole chapter on the Great Depression. And what they've literally done, Schwartz has done most of this. Schwartz has gone to banks and said, show me your books. And then she's added up column by column. How much money is in your vault? How much money is on deposit? How much money is circulating? And so they literally have graphs, you can see them in the book, of how much money has been circulating in the U.S. at various different points in time. And when they get to the Great Depression, they find the quantity of money available in the economy goes down by a third. And in some ways, this is completely obvious because so many banks have failed. And we don't have any type of bank insurance at that point. So if your bank goes under, your savings are there, the money essentially vanishes. And it's fractional reserve banking, right? So you've put in, they can loan up to 90% off on their deposits. And so Friedman and Schwartz present this argument that what really made the Great Depression so bad was this drop in the amount of money, the 30% drop in the money. They call it the Great Contraction. And then they go further and they say, well, how did this happen and why? And they pinpoint the Federal Reserve, which is a fairly new institution at that time. And they say, what did the Federal Reserve do? the lender of last resort. What did it do in the face of what they're depicting as a massive, unprecedented liquidity crisis? And they find it's not really doing much. And they really dig into the details, and they find that the Federal Reserve has gone through a sort of personnel change, and some of the key leaders in the 1920s, Benjamin Strong is one of them. He's now deceased. And the dominance of the New York Federal Reserve, which in their telling, is global, it's interconnected, it's seen a lot of financial things come and go. And they believe that the New York Fed had the understanding to recognize this is a liquidity crisis. We should be very generous. We should support all the banks. Their influence has diminished for the kind of banks that are more, they don't say like the Rubes and the Hicks, but it basically is. It's like the people in charge don't know what they're doing. And so the Fed pursues this kind of policy of masterly inactivity. They don't see it as their problem. They don't do much. There's an enormous liquidity crisis. And that's their version of what the Great Depression is all about, that it's a financial system meltdown, it's a liquidity crisis, and that it in some ways, well, in many ways, they argue, very strong counterfactual argument, the Federal Reserve could have prevented it, and it did not. And so it becomes then an institutional failure and a political failure, not a failure of capitalism as a system. And so this book comes out, it's a blockbuster, and even those economists who've been like, Friedman is a crank, I don't buy it, are like, Friedman and Schwartz are onto something. Milton Friedman, Anna Schwartz are onto something. And so that really changes the game. And this is also one of his most influential contributions, because Friedman and Schwartz becomes the playbook for the Federal Reserve. And we have lived through this, right? In the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve is ready to loan. COVID, the Federal Reserve does all kinds of new things, because no Federal Reserve chair wants to be in Friedman and Schwartz 2.0 that somebody writes, or they're the bad guy who let the economy melt down. So, the specifics of what they say to do have obviously evolved as the system has changed, but this is a playbook for how to deal with economic crisis. It's Friedman and Schwartz. And so it's absolutely fundamental, and that is really going to be the place he makes his mark.
There's a lot of things to say here. So first, the book we're talking about is A Monetary History of the United States, in part for which Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize. You've also mentioned the influence of the Great Depression. If you could even just rewind to that.
Yes.
So he went to, I guess, college in Rutgers.
That's right.
And he was, mathematical proclivities. So he was kind of wanted to be a mathematician. And so it's kind of a cool crossroads. It's interesting how the right time, the right person arrives, right? So you described this really well, so he had this choice to be a mathematician or an economist. And the economist is the University of Chicago, mathematician is Brown University, whichever. And then this is also the beginnings, as you've described, of mathematical economics. So he fits in nicely into this using, I think you said the number of equations started going up per paper, which is a really nice way to put it. So really the right person at the right time to try to solve this puzzle of the economy melting down. It's so interesting. Just one human. It's just from just zooming in on a single human making a decision about life. And it's hard to know when you're in it that the world is melting down from an economics perspective, and that I could do something about this to figure out what it is. And also I'm going to reject the mainstream narrative about why this happened.
Yeah. So the other piece of the puzzle, when he goes to Rutgers, he thinks he'll be an actuary. So Milton Friedman's family, his parents are immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. They're pretty atypical in that they don't stay in New York, and they move to Rahway, New Jersey, and they put together a fairly middle-class life as kind of, they have a shop, they do some wholesale buying and selling, and then his father dies when he's 16. His life becomes more precarious, but it's never as precarious as he makes it out to be. He's got 3 older sisters, they earn a good living. Incidentally, they all have better grades in high school than he does, but he's the one that goes to college. And but it's actually really important that he loses his father figure, because he's then looking for other father figures. And he meets two at Rutgers. One is Arthur Burns, who will go on to have a huge influence in his career. No relation to me, by the way. But Arthur Burns is like him, a fellow Jewish immigrant boy on the make. He's older. And he's making a career as an economist. And then there's Homer Jones, who has gone to the University of Chicago and is studying with Frank Knight at Chicago and says, you have to go to Chicago. So he has these two mentors. And Burns in particular suggests, oh, I could be an economist. That could be my career path. You know, the idea to be an actuary for an insurance company, I'm not sure where he got that idea, but he just thought that was something he could do as someone who was good at math. And so the college really opens the perspective, opens the door. And then I think it's really key that he doesn't get an explanation that he buys for the Great Depression. So then he's looking for one. And the math part is really interesting aspect of his career. Now, he actually comes to Chicago to study with the mathematical economist, Henry Schultz. But he gets there and he thinks Schultz is kind of dumb. He really does. Yeah. He's incredibly arrogant, and he just thinks this guy's not that smart. And it seems that, I mean, Schultz did some really important work in the early stages of mathematical economics, but a lot of the oral histories about him are like, yeah, he wasn't that bright. So Friedman's maybe onto something. Yep. So he falls into the set of students who are really enthralled with his other professor, Frank Knight. And Frank Knight is against math and economics. Frank Knight is like, a neoclassical economist, but not a mathematical economist. He's an old school liberal. He's really concerned about liberal democracy, economic liberalism. And Friedman is very deeply influenced by Knight. And he continues to pursue mathematical economics, though. He'll go, for part of his graduate career, he goes to Columbia University, where he actually gets his PhD from, and he works with a mathematical economist there. And so he comes out trained in what will eventually be econometrics, statistics and economics. His early publications are in statistics, but it's not really where his intellectual heart and soul are. And eventually he will turn very profoundly against mathematics in economics and become a sort of heterodox strain throughout 20th century economics that says simple models are better. We need to work off empirical data, not construct elegant models, and becomes really sort of countercultural within economics in that way.
And the test of a good model is it should actually predict stuff that happens.
It should predict stuff that happened. It should tie back to what's going on.